Hey folks, this is Rhykker with a video on the gameplay of the Darksiders series. If you haven't, be sure to have checked out my video on the lore and story of the Darksiders series, which does share some similarities with the lore and story of Diablo, because Darksiders 3 is releasing November 27th. Follow the link in the video description for more information on Darksiders 3, and thanks to THQ Nordic for sponsoring this video. So first off, Darksiders is a third-person hack-and-slash action-adventure game series with light RPG elements in which you take on the role of one of the Horsemen of the Apocalypse. In Darksiders 1, you play as War. In Darksiders 2, you play as Death. And in Darksiders 3, you will play as Fury. And these games are as much about fighting enemies as they are about solving puzzles, platforming, and exploring the world. As you progress through the story, you unlock and acquire new abilities, new weapons, and access new areas in the world to explore. And often you'll see an area that you'll be visiting in the future, but you won't be able to access it right now because you haven't yet acquired the right piece of equipment or the right skill to be able to access it. It's a nice little bit of foreshadowing, and I was really impressed by the richness of the world. Everything is very detailed and fantastical, and you're rewarded for exploring this world with hidden loot and different collectibles that you can find in the world that will give you a permanent buff. Now, Darksiders 1 did not have any RPG elements. It's Darksiders 2 that introduced the RPG elements to the franchise. An experience system, a leveling system, a skill tree, and an itemization system not unlike what you'd find in an action RPG. As you play through a Darksiders game, you'll follow the main campaign, but also have access to plenty of side quests. You'll explore a vast open world while frequently visiting a sort of town hub to get new quests, to get access to vendors, and then you'll find dungeons filled with puzzles and enemies and loot and a boss at the end. And to help navigate this vast world, you have fast travel. And while you're in a dungeon, you can travel back to the overworld without losing your dungeon progress. Kind of like town portaling. And you can also summon a horse when you're out in open spaces. Not just any regular horse either. Behold, a pale horse, and his name that rode upon him was Death, and Hell followed with him. That always struck me as a super cool quote. Now let's talk a bit about the puzzle and platforming elements, which often go hand in hand. Apart from just running and jumping, you'll find yourself needing to swim, to climb, to wall run, to navigate the world and its puzzles. To traverse areas, you frequently need to solve puzzle elements. Levers, doors, elevators, portals, rolly balls, all kinds of stuff. Sometimes actually riding an enemy, like physically mounting and riding an enemy, or NPC or creature is necessary to solve a puzzle, or to travel to an area that is otherwise inaccessible. And yes, that includes flying creatures. Then in both Darksiders 1 and 2, you eventually gain access to an item called the Abyssal Chain. It's like a grappling hook that can pull enemies to you, sort of like Scorpion in Mortal Kombat. Except better, because if the enemy is too big, then it will pull you to the enemy. And it can also be used to traverse terrain by swinging across chasms, kind of like Spider-Man or Tarzan, but no one gets Tarzan references anymore. Now, as with any game that involves puzzles and exploration, you can sometimes find yourself stumped. But Death has a pet raven that can help guide him to his objectives. That said, while the raven helps, it doesn't hold your hand. It may give you an idea of where to go, but it's not always super reliable. So this is anything but a brainless game. You really need to think. Alright, let's talk about the combat. Combat has a heavy focus on combo maneuvers. The easiest of which are just a simple sequence of pressing the same button over and over and over again. And while you can just spam and hope for the best, learning the actual combos and when to use the appropriate ones certainly will be necessary if you're playing on higher difficulties. And depending on the type of weapon you're wielding, you'll have a different move list and different combo attacks. A weapon can have almost 24 different combos that can be performed in different scenarios. Some are as easy as just pressing the same attack key multiple times, with each additional press performing a subsequent maneuver in the combo chain, but also simple placement of pauses in the chain can be altering the combo and performing a different kind of combo. And then you can also buy new combo maneuvers from certain trainer NPCs, and then in addition to the combo maneuvers, you also have blocks and counters and dodges and even execution maneuvers against foes with very little health. Now, apart from your basic attacks and combos, you also have abilities. There's a form of mana and spellcasting system. Wrath powers, which consume a resource called, surprise, surprise, Wrath. And as you progress, you gain more Wrath powers. In Darksiders 1, War has 4 Wrath abilities that level up as you progress throughout the game. You have Blade Geyser, an area of effect attack. You have Stone Skin, which gives you temporary damage resistance and extra damage. Attack damage, not extra damage to yourself, that wouldn't make sense. Immolation, which sets nearby enemies on fire. And Affliction, which is a ranged attack that quite literally shoots snakes at enemies. What's not to like? Now in Darksiders 2, more RPG mechanics were added to the skill system. Death gains XP and levels up and can spend points in a skill tree. There are a total of 8 main skills that you can acquire that are divided into 2 skill trees, or 2 branches of the tree. You have the Harbinger tree, which has skills focused on melee combat, high damage skill, offensive skills, and even evasive skills. Then you have the Necromancer tree, which focuses on ranged, summoning, and defensive spells. And then lastly, apart from your Wrath abilities, you also have an Ultimate form, in which for a short time you deal more damage, are nearly invulnerable, and have access to special abilities. Death's ultimate form is a sort of Grim Reaper, and War's Chaos form looks like a big demon. So in total you have 3 resources to manage. You have your health, which can be refilled with health potions. You have Wrath, which can be refilled with Wrath potions, and you have your ultimate form, which can be activated once you successfully deal enough melee damage to enemies. You build up your bar, and then you can unleash your ultimate whenever you want, and then it's depleted and you have to build it up again. Alright, let's talk about items. Let's start with armor. Now in Darksiders 1, itemization was a lot simpler. You had the Abyssal armor set that you can find, broken down into 10 pieces, scattered throughout the world that you had to find the pieces individually, and it wasn't mandatory to acquire. You can go through the whole game with never getting any of the armor. It was simply extra challenge for extra reward. Now Darksiders 2 expands on the itemization of its predecessor by introducing something of an ARPG itemization system. Weapons and armor can drop from enemies, can be looted from chests, or destructible vases, or of course, purchased from vendors. Items will have different attributes, so for instance, you'll find multiple pairs of boots and have to decide which pair gives you the buffs that you want. And that's apart from some items just being higher level than others. It's all very familiar to action RPG players. Now, for instance, one item may buff your strength, whereas the other buffs your agility, and etc. So it's definitely not just that every item you find is going to be a higher level version of the other and you just equip it. You have choices to make. Now, Darksiders 2 takes the concept of armor sets from Darksiders 1 and really goes to town with it, including several types of armor sets, each with different buffs. Some are focused on buffing spellcasting powers, some on melee abilities, some a combination of both. And in Darksiders 2, armor sets consist of 4 pieces. You got your torso, your boots, your shoulders, and your gloves. And completing this set unlocks the set bonus. And speaking of armor pieces, in total there are 7 types of equipment slots: primary weapon, secondary weapon, shoulder armor, glove, boot, and talisman. So let's talk about weapons. In Darksiders 1, the weapons in your arsenal consist of War's personal weapons, which you can enhance as you progress, as well as other temporary enemy weapons that you grab off of slain foes. War's weapons include a sword, a scythe, a handgun, a gauntlet, and something called a crossblade. This is the first ranged weapon that you get, and it's often used as well, in addition to killing people, to solve puzzles, such as by hitting a lever from a distance. You also at some point get an artifact called Earthcaller, which knocks back and stuns enemies. Now you can upgrade Wrath's weapons by adding different enhancements to them. For instance, the Hellfire enhancement wreathes the weapon in flames, giving you a chance to set enemies on fire, dealing damage over time. The Bloodthirst enhancement gives you Life Leech. In other words, a portion of damage is converted to healing. And you can either buy enhancements or find them in the world. There's about a dozen different enhancements in total. Now, Darksiders 2 does things differently. First off, you have 3 types of weapons. You have your primary weapons, which are scythes that you dual wield. Then you have your secondary weapons, which are grouped into 2 classes. Your heavy weapons, which require 2 hands to use, are slow and hard-hitting. These include maces, hammers, axes, and glaives. And each of these behaves differently. It's not just a cosmetic change. Then you have your melee class weapons, which include claws and gauntlets and bucklers and arm blades. These are the fast, short-range weapons that include combos that give you maneuvers that can rapidly close the distance between yourself and an enemy. And in addition to these weapons, Death also has a handgun similar to War's. Now you sometimes also get very rare possessed weapons, and you can upgrade these weapons by sacrificing other items. When you do so, when you sacrifice an item, you're basically feeding XP into your possessed weapon, and when it gains enough XP, it levels up, it becomes more powerful, and then it gains an enhancement that you select. Now, as a very quick teaser for Darksiders 3, we see even more changes, with Fury, the main character, having a main weapon that basically transforms into different forms. It goes from being a whip to a hammer to nunchucks. And then she also has the ability to swap between different hollow forms as magical abilities. She has the fire hollow, which gifts her certain fire abilities and lets her, for instance, walk through lava. And then she also has the force hollow, in which she gains the ability to effectively become a magnet, but we'll get into all that in our third video. Alright, so you got all these weapons, all these combo attacks, all these abilities. Who are you using them on? Let's talk about the enemies. In the Darksiders series, you fight all manner of angels and demons, undead, beasts, and constructs. And they come in all shapes and sizes, some of them truly gigantic. You've got melee enemies, ranged enemies, spellcasting enemies, flying enemies, and even mounted enemies. And of course, giant spiders. Every game has to have giant spiders. Now, apart from regular enemies, you also fight boss monsters, which are often very important battles that require using your brain as well as your skills. Some bosses can't be defeated if you don't solve the puzzle on how to defeat them, which may require using specific weapons, tactics, or even objects from the environment. For instance, this boss here can't be hurt at all until you figure out you have to grab its babies and throw them at the boss, turning it on its side so that you can damage its underbelly. And bosses come in varying strengths or difficulties as well. The progression goes from regular enemies to super enemies to mini bosses to, finally, regular bosses. And that's going to wrap up our discussion on the gameplay of Darksiders. All of this leads into Darksiders 3, in which we'll take on the role of yet another horseman, Fury. In our final video on this series, we'll be taking a look at Darksiders 3 and how Fury differs from her fellow horsemen. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykker's Raiders for more gaming content.